And good day. Well, we have a new toy, the MiG-15, and I wanted to take it out and see if we couldn't get a good game with it. I've had it out several other times and failed miserably. That's not the game's fault, nor is it the plane's fault. I think it's mine. So that being said, let's see if we can't have a good game in it.
Get ready for action. Let's go.
Now, what the MiG-15 is to what was the Soviet Union was nothing less than sheer nirvana. The aircraft they always wished they could have had, and thanks to the British Labour government, they finally got it. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it was an aircraft that had they had the MiG-9, which they were less than satisfied with. And it all came down to they had, at that time, the MiG-9, and the engine that came with it was not something you particularly wanted. There were copies of the German BMW and Junkers Jumo that they'd taken and replicated. And to say that they had a few problems was an understatement. And those that want to go look up the my videos on that are welcome to. The 626 was literally an aircraft that you didn't want. And the reasons were simple. The engine was the primary failing of it, though it had many others. And it comes down to the simple fact that without a good engine, you don't have a good aircraft. And it's as true today as it ever was. Luckily, they have good engines today. Okay. I'm going to overrun this guy. Unless I ram, which I did. For those of you unaware, I'm not really fond of ramming as a tactic, but by God, every once in a while. I also have changed mice, as my previous mouse was not getting the job done anymore, and I found out to my dismay that my newfound problem with aiming had a lot more to do with the shitty mouse than it did with my aim. I.e., I was looking at a video and noticing my mouse cursor just wandering off all over the screen. At that point, it occurred to me, you've got a problem. And I finally went and did something about it. Turned out I had a spare mouse that was working just fine, and that solved that issue. I just wish I had realized it before. Now, one thing you will notice about the MiG very quickly is it has a terrible burst time. And so I would recommend, rather than getting a long barrels or other things that you would consider kind of nice to have, that you instead work on either doing a lot more damage or increasing the burst length. Yes, even at the cost of accuracy, which is what I normally prefer. I come from the sharpshooter school of shooting. That's a gift of my father, who well and truly believed that aim was everything, and proceeded to demonstrate it by being a world-class trap shooter. Good man who I miss very much. Died about 20 years ago. And I miss him to this day.
Be advised, a line of thunderstorms is approaching. We'll soon be unable to provide support. Do you copy? Over. Victory is in sight. Keep it up.
Now, what the MiG has going for it more than anything else is speed, as well as decent maneuverability, not great maneuverability. But it does have speed and decent maneuverability and a so-so gun.
There's a heavy storm here. Unable to proceed. Returning to base. Do you copy?
The J7W2 can maneuver with this. The J7W3 will outperform you, and so please be aware. Boy, is this mouse making a difference.
We're waiting for your return.
All right. Okay, so good cash, good experience, good free experience. Got a token out of it. 13 destroyed, 1 assist. Got salvage. Got my 3 candy canes for the Candy Cash Road deal. And team score came in a handy number 1. All right. Let's go into a little bit of the history of the aircraft, because it is a storied aircraft and really didn't end its evolution until the end of the MiG-17. This was a gift from the British Labour government in the very late 40s. They essentially licensed the British 9 engine, which is a centrifugal type of engine. That's a type of engine that uses a centrifuge instead of fan blades in the front, which you'll find in an axial flow type of engine. And it was one with very limited development. Everybody got away from that, and any aircraft you see today that's a true turbojet or turbofan engine is an axial flow engine. And what was the difference? Well, if you want more thrust, you have to keep increasing the size of your centrifuge, and of course you get to a point of diminishing returns where the drag of the centrifuge begins to overcome the thrust of the engine. So it's got a very limited size and thrust span. But it was the engine that you'd find in Vampires, you'd find in Meteors, you would find in various other aircraft. It was superseded by the Avon engine. But the Soviet government approached the British Labour government and said, would you consider letting us license the engine? And so they sent over the technical specs and everything. The Soviets gleefully paid for it. And that became the basis of the MiG-15. Well, they had a good aircraft to start with the MiG-9 that had some gas ingestion problems. And that turned out to be easily solved with a new aircraft design. And when you look at the aircraft itself, you'll notice that the guns actually sit well below the engine intake, which solved the issue. It has a pair of 23 and a 37 millimeter cannon. It has a, I think it would have been better served by a quartet of 23s than adding a massive 37 millimeter to it. But the Soviet government at that time was very, and please understand, for those of you who don't watch history at all, the Soviet Union fell in 1989. So when I'm talking about the Soviet government, I'm really talking about another regime, not today's Russia. But they had good bones to work with. So you had the MiG-9, which was a pretty good aircraft. It had some gas ingestion problems with the at high altitude. Other than that, it was an oxygen-rich environment and worked just fine. But at high altitude, it was enough to choke off the engine. Well, that's not what you want in a fighter. And so they got the 9, they installed it in here, and it performed phenomenally. Now, there is no freebie in aerodynamic engineering, right? One of them comes down to the fact that this was a 7,000 plus pound aircraft. Its competitor was an 11,000 pound aircraft. It gives you an idea of why its climb rate was so much superior to the F-86A, which did fly against it for a short time. It was superseded by E's, F's, and eventually H's. So a much lighter aircraft, but that came at the cost of range. It never had the kind of range that the Sabre did. That's why you don't hear of MiGs coming on intrusion missions far down into the south where they could have been useful, that sort of thing. There was a massive penalty for it as well. As a defensive fighter, worked just fine. And that's the way it was primarily used. The Sabres were always on the offensive and meeting the MiGs over their territory rather than the other way around. Why? Well, because the MiGs couldn't get over UN territory very well and survive because of the short range. And nothing eats up fuel like dogfighting and fighting in general. You're not trying to go at cruise speed. Your throttle's jammed against the firewall more often than not, so forth and so on, and you run out of fuel, and it's time to go home regardless of where you're at, unless you want to walk home. If you get lucky and you don't get captured. Go check with the ME 109E for examples of that over the Battle of Britain. Germany faced much of the same problem. So this turned out to be a pretty good aircraft for them, but it had severe issues at extreme high speed. It is most famous for fighting this aircraft. And the higher the speed got and below 26,000 feet, it owned the MiG in just about every flight regime imaginable except thrust. It could climb much faster because it had a better power to weight ratio. Above 26,000 feet, it then became how fast were you going? Well, if you were going fast, really fast, and you're having to maneuver, this was still the better aircraft. Short of that, this was the better aircraft. Given equal pilots and making use of them, they came out to be about equal, more or less. Given inexperienced pilots, the MiG, the Sabre won almost every time. It was 11-to-1 kill ratio speaks to that. And there are a number of reasons before that, but a lot of them were that the pilots the U.S. put in place were guys that had been in World War II, knew the aircraft very well, far more experienced. And the guys they racked up the most kills against were the North Koreans and Chinese volunteers, who hadn't had nearly the experience or flight time. And this was not an easy aircraft to fly. It was an easy one to eliminate yourself in, as, by the way, was this one. Okay? Because, you know, in the West we kind of think we're the kings of everything, but it's not true. Every model of F-86 could change its flight parameters by quite a lot. Some of them had leading edge slats, some of them did not. The engine output changed and the center of gravity changed slightly between all models. It was extremely tough aircraft to fly. This one was not really that great a plane until the BIS model, or improved version, came out. And they still weren't done with it due to it's had the propensity to go into a flat spin you couldn't recover from. You get to eject or die. Had other issues that were fairly severe in the aerodynamic regimes it could find itself in that were essentially unsolvable. And so they moved on to the MiG-17, which really did address all of them. And that's just typical of the age that it was flying in. All right. I mean, when you start looking at it, this aircraft didn't become all it could be until the late model F and H models. And it was right at 700 miles an hour, by which time it could easily keep up with the MiG-15 and whatever variant you wanted to talk about. But it's not the only one that had a problem. This took, there are 4 generations of the Swift. Only the 5th and the 6th model marks of this came out as being decent aircraft, and it was never really loved. The Hunter was a sheer animal in its abilities. But that being said, it had a ridiculously stupid range that wasn't really solved until much later marks, when they had to add fuselage tank capacity and add bag tanks to the wings, and only then did it become a great aircraft. So this is not unusual, but this was a game changer. Mark my words. The MiG-15 was a game changer. The idea that you could ever take Soviet aircraft as being inferior to Western aircraft died here, right here. Listen, folks, I do appreciate you spending time with me today. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to ask you to like the video and to subscribe, and we will see you tomorrow. If you want to support the channel, you can do so on the channel page, and you'll find the Patreon mark on the main channel page in the upper right hand corner. Thank you very much. Have a great day.